So session 3 of the high priest, or the priesthood of Jesus, and today I'm looking at the high priest. We're focusing on his role because we see Jesus as our great high priest. And the picture at the beginning of our reflection shows a high priest in his robes, and Aaron was the first high priest. And we're given the instructions about his garments in Exodus 28. It's a detailed description of the high priest's garments. Firstly, he had to put on a pair of breeches. They were made from linen and they went from waist to thigh. And then over the top was a linen tunic, and over the top of the tunic a blue ephod, which was reinforced around the neck so it wouldn't tear. It was clasped at the shoulders, and then a breastplate was put over the top of that. And on the breastplate were 12 stones naming the tribes. And on his head he had a turban made of linen, and a gold plate on it described holy to the Lord. Around the base of the ephod were alternating bells and pomegranates. Now these garments all had meaning. Firstly, the use of linen. We're told in Revelation 19:8 how the bride, that is the church, has made herself ready. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given to her to wear. Fine linen stands for the righteousness of God's people. So the linen stands for righteousness. These linen undergarments are a physical picture of what God has done for us. The priest had to wear the linen breeches in the presence of God, or they would incur death, guilt and death. These breeches are something which the priest had to put on himself, because you needed to step into them. So he would lower them to the ground and step in. And it's a picture of what God has done in Jesus. Jesus was lowered to earth, but we have to make that step of stepping in ourselves. This is a physical garment of salvation which prefigures the spiritual salvation which we wear. Now we're going to cut to a more detailed picture of the high priest and his clothes so we can talk a little bit more about them. So here we have a picture of the high priest in his robes, and I just want to describe what some of them represent. We've talked about him putting on the breeches, which are his undergarments, but once he'd put those on, then someone would put this tunic over his head. So you've got the white tunic, and it would be linen, and remembering linen is the symbol of righteousness. But over the tunic was this blue robe, and blue, of course, represents the presence of God. So what you've got happening is the priest has stepped into the breeches himself, so he's stepped into salvation. Then somebody places a robe over his head, a linen robe, a robe of righteousness. And this is what happens when we come to Jesus. We step into salvation. He puts a robe of righteousness over us, and that's his righteousness. But then he gives us the Holy Spirit, and this is the representation of the blue. He puts the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit is over us. And along the bottom here are a bell and a pomegranate, bell, pomegranate, bell, pomegranate, all the way around. And these represent the gifts and the fruit of the Holy Spirit. And you might sort of get the picture in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about, look, I might have all the gifts of the Spirit, but if I don't have love, I'm just like a clanging bell. Well, this represents that the fruit between each bell would stop the bells from banging together and just making a nasty sound. When they're separated by the fruit like that, they make a lovely tinkle. So that's the blue. You notice here that the robe is clasped with 2 clasps, and they have precious stones on them and the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, 6 on each shoulder. And then he put on this breastplate, and again you can see 12 precious stones, and each stone had the name of one of the tribes of Israel. So that as the priest came into the presence of God, he bore the names of the tribes. In other words, he bore the people before God on his shoulders and on his heart. And also in the breastplate would have been the Urim and Thummim, which they used to use to find out what God wanted of them. And so the responsibility to find out the will of God was also carried on his heart. And then finally, he had this turban, and round the top here was written holy to the Lord. And what that was, that tells us in Exodus 28, Aaron bore that on his forehead because he bore the guilt of all the sins that had been brought for sacrifice. So he bore that on his forehead, and he bore it into the presence of God, so the sins or the forgiveness would be acceptable to God. So just looking at that, we can see how these garments prefigure the work of Jesus.